All right, so now I'm really excited about this one because we've got some great guests speaking on this panel discussion. Um, but this is something we've been kind of leading into all day long, kind of on the metaverse. When we had the talking about the digital literacy and the equipment there, looking at what the students are doing up in the X-ray lab, it's kind of all leaning into what is the metaverse. What we hear about it on the news, we hear about it in different publications and such, but and I think I got a pretty good idea of the metaverse, but I know Dr. Mihaela Popescu is the all-knowing expert at this. And matter of fact, I can't wait for we get the new headsets. That's what I really want. Some new VR headsets are going to be coming out soon. A little pricey, but I want one of those things. Anyways, so Mihaela, I'm going to pass it on to you and let you introduce your wonderful panel. I see some great faces that I get to see there, but I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, James. For those of you who are just joining, I am Mihaela Popescu. I'm a professor of media studies at Cal State San Bernardino, and I am also the faculty director of the ITS Innovation Lab, lovingly known as the Extended Reality for Learning Lab. I am really excited about this panel, and this panel has a little bit of an interesting history. So, as you know from this morning, we've discussed the ITS 2022-2025 strategy, a goal of which is to build a virtual communication hub for CSUSB. And every time I talk about this goal with my colleagues on campus, I hear the following response. Oh, so you guys want to build the CSUSB in the metaverse? And I always go like, do we really? Is that what we are doing? So I thought it would be really interesting to have a discussion about what the metaverse is, what are the possible benefits and dangers, if you want, for higher education, and whether it's inevitable that we end up building campuses in the metaverse. I am really honored to have with me distinguished panelists whom I'm going to let introduce themselves, but I would simply like to overview for you the great collection of brains we have among in this panel. So starting with Kate Mifid, who is the Director of Innovation with the Chancellor's Office for the CSU system. Dr. Sean Hawes, who is the Director of Information Technology Services at San Diego State. Shane Burrell, who is a PhD student at the University of Oregon and one of our alumni. And of course, last but definitely not the least, Professor Rob Ray at CSUSB in Art and Design. And with that, I'm just going to go into two brief housekeeping matters. So first, we would like this panel to be interactive. So if anybody in the audience has any question for the panelists, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat and I will be sure to bring the question to the table. And second, it's I would like to ask the permission of the panelists to address them by their first name. Would that be okay with you? Great. So with that, I would like to ask Kate to introduce herself, and then I will go in the order in which everybody appears on my screen.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Mihaela, and I'm really delighted to talk with you all this afternoon. My name is Kate Mifid, as Mihaela said, and the Director for Innovation in IT in the Chancellor's Office. And so part of what I do day to day is to support innovation projects at the campus level to surface emerging technology areas that are of interest among faculty, staff, and students at the campuses, and then build some communities and programming around those interest areas. My background is in instructional design, so I tend to look at technologies from the lens of like the pedagogical applications and possibilities. So I can pause there and we can move on to the next panelist.
Thank you. Sean?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Mihaela, thank you so much, Mihaela and team, for having me and for having us today on this exciting topic. It's always fun to step away from our other less exciting duties to talk about fun stuff like this. So on that note, I'm the Director of Instructional Technology Services here at San Diego State University, and we manage everything from Canvas, learning management system, to the physical learning environments, as well as fun stuff like I also serve as director of the Virtual Immersive Teaching and Learning, or VITAL, Research Center here at SDSU, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And Rob?
Greetings all. I'm an associate professor of design at CSUSB. Most of my research is in extended realities in all of its forms, and particularly the UX and UI concerns within that field. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And Shane, sorry.
How dare you, Mihaela? Hi, everyone. My name is Shane. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oregon, CSUSB alumni. My research lies on the psychological aspects of virtual reality and how virtual reality can possibly have an influence on our attitudes and behaviors. So I really look at like how playing in virtual reality has an impact on us, and how virtual reality can really be utilized in the realm of pedagogy or practice and commerce. So.
Thank you. As you can see, we have a lot of expertise amassed into one small panel, and we are definitely looking forward to the discussion today. When I was preparing for this panel, I realized that about this time last year, Facebook had just become Meta. And predictably enough, once Facebook announced that they are interested in building the metaverse, the term metaverse has overtaken the interest. I mean, I was looking at the global level of interest in terms such as virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality. Of course, metaverse is way beyond that in terms of interest. The term extended reality that doesn't even seem to attract any more attention whatsoever. And yet, if we were to ask people what is the metaverse, I think that each of us would have probably a very different definition. So before we go into the nitty-gritty of what metaverse can do for education, I wonder if I could ask each of you, what is the metaverse for you, starting with Kate?
All right. So, it's interesting because you shared some of these questions in advance, and then I was like, do I really know what the metaverse is? Because I think the kind of cynical perspective is that it is just kind of clever marketing from Facebook, kind of a thing that's been around for a long time. So, I did my graduate thesis on Second Life in 2008. So, the idea of these kind of persistent virtual worlds has been around for some time. And so I think there's one aspect of it that's a little buzzwordy. And then I kind of, was doing a little bit of research in preparation for this. And then it kind of sounds, and it got an article that kind of corroborates that, right? That there's this notion of the metaverse, but it isn't that singular space like you would read about in something like Snow Crash or Ready Player One or any of those kind of sci-fi kind of worlds that we've kind of heard about. It's really like all of the technology companies are coming up with competing metaverses, plural, that are just these virtual worlds that I think we have some degree of familiarity with because they've been around for a while in different permutations. So I'm kind of coming at it from that angle, that it's not a singular, well-defined thing at this time, but something that does create some buzz and a bit of attention.
Thank you. Sean, what is the metaverse for you?
Yeah, good question. And Mihaela, obviously the co-opting of the term by Meta and of course every other company since then has been interesting. And I think it further confuses the students, the faculty, the community that we serve. So it's a really good question that you have. I think in a lot of ways, the metaverse is already here. It's just there are different metaverses. I think Kate was alluding to this in that because we're part of a capitalist culture where different companies are establishing their kind of metaverse territory, there's gaming metaverses. I'm holding my Apple AirPods here. I think very much Apple has created a bit of a metaverse. When you put these on, you're in the ecosystem, you're getting your alerts, but you're also listening to a podcast and flowing through the universe that we all share, while also hearing this kind of overlay of tech on top of it. But I think at the most basic level in which we imagine a future metaverse that's taking shape now of augmented and virtual reality it is kind of a paradigm shift away from the 2D screens that we're all presumably looking at right now. And I think a good way of imagining what that will be is similar to our relationship with landline telephones. Now that I'm 35 years old, I've never owned my own landline at home. I've had a cell phone, since I was a teenager. And I think similarly, students in another 15 or 20 years, people in another 15 or 20 years will look back at all of the rectangles that we had on our desk, on our wall, in our pocket, right? And say, you really had rectangles everywhere when you could really just have this content overlaid in whatever context you wanted. So I think the metaverse is a lack of rectangles everywhere.
That's the most concise definition I've ever heard. Shane, may I pick your brain on what the metaverse is?
Yeah, definitely. Everyone brings up really, really good points. And again, as you presented the prompts to us earlier, I was sitting and thinking about it, and my mind immediately went to like a critical discourse analysis of this, right? So like I think of it in the sense of like it being like a capitalistic like discourse sort of globalization of like the term metaverse itself is like this all-encompassing term. But in reality, when we really think of it, and really what it is that it's just a step to what I think would like Web 3.0 but would be, right? As we are like continuously like advancing technologies and things are becoming obsolete and they're being replaced, and like the new version of something is coming out, like every single time we have this sort of step in that direction, we're moving closer to this like horizon of non-tangible economies and like world of commerce and the ways of pedagogy and education and understanding effect and all of this stuff. So I see the metaverse as not necessarily a place, as everyone has said, because it's like multi-universal, right? But more so as a narrowing of gaps. Like even augmented reality and virtual reality are going to become obsolete at some point and be replaced by something else. So I see the metaverse as just kind of like a stepping stool to a place of, and I try to like steer away from this, but like the singularity theory. So.
Oh dear. So I really hope we are not getting there where the metaverse will take over everything. Thank you, Shane. Rob, what is the metaverse for you?
Such a tough question coming out the gate. I mean, I think of the metaverse as an ecosystem of technology stacks that all have a kind of experiential goal in mind. But you could also think of it maybe as just a maturation of the mobile internet and the kind of synergistic overlappings that happened in like battery technology, UI design, chip manufacturing, mobile networking, like all of these kind of things, kind of digital imaging with cameras, like this stuff started to come together, and everyone kind of collectively saw the synergies there and kind of ran with it. And so this might just be another kind of push with that same momentum, but it might be something else entirely too. It might just also be a lesson in the dangers of pre-branding an idea, but we'll see.
It's interesting. I mean, listening to these four very different answers in some way. I mean, there are clearly commonalities among the answers, but also differences. And one difference that I noted is the distinction between imagining the metaverse in terms of technologies of the visual. So technologies that involve some kind of different relationship to the space, right, around us, versus technologies of power, technologies that are going to take over in some way, particular modes of productions, particular modes of expression, and so on. So I would like to explore both of these aspects, if I may, and first ask you about technologies of vision and what we most commonly associate with the metaverse, namely virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and so on. And since you are all from different campuses, of course, I can't help, or different places, I can't help but ask each of you, what are you doing with these technologies at your place of work, right? So how is your interaction with these technologies going? And again, I'm going to start with Kate.
I think what I'm doing is giving you and Sean money. Um, no,
And we are very grateful for it.
No, the more serious answer is, I think, from the system perspective, it's kind of that, planting lots of seeds and seeing what blooms. So I think, from a system perspective, we're seeing a lot of experimentation in this space. Some of it kind of really focused and kind of research oriented around, STEM applications, nursing applications. We see kind of the more like open source, scalable applications for engagement and events and things that are kind of for more like add-on as opposed to having clear kind of pedagogical goals. And so I think kind of, from my perspective, it's kind of looking at these kind of very different flavors that are surfacing at the campus level and kind of trying to connect the dots to facilitate information and knowledge sharing. But it's from this vantage point, there's a lot of different kinds of activities happening at the system.
And Sean, what are you doing with these technologies at San Diego State?
Yeah, and I find myself answering in another unintentionally deductive way rather than saying what it is, what it's not. I'll say that as technologists here and as the director of the academic technology group, we often are looking for reasons not to use technology, especially now post the start of the pandemic, with every answer being, oh, we can use Zoom and we can use technology for assessment rather than authentic assessment, things like that, right? So I think what we're focusing on is low frequency, high risk scenarios. So scenarios that would be either out of reach, too dangerous, or impossible without this type of technology. I think in the future, a true metaverse will result in doing things via augmented and virtual reality because it's more fun, it's more rich, it's again all we have. Maybe we won't have smartphones in our pockets, it will just be audio enabled, smart glasses, headphones, that kind of thing. But for now, at these early stages, we're focusing on life-threatening medical scenarios that students may not see in their clinical rounds that we can guarantee that they can see with this type of augmented reality simulation, as well as things that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise, like go inside of a human vein or go back in time to a historical event, that kind of thing. So that's what we see as kind of low-hanging fruit. And again, we want to enable more face-to-face human interactions where possible. So if something is just as good or better without tech, we want to keep that free of tech for now.
That's exactly how we approach it as well, particularly given how expensive these technologies are to incorporate in the classroom. Thank you. And Rob, how do you use virtual reality in your classes and your work outside those classes?
Sure. Yeah, I get to cheat on this question because I teach a virtual reality class, so I have a very terse yet big answer to that. But my own sort of creative practice and research has been in augmented reality and some degrees mixed reality, and that's just really a result of my own personal enthusiasm for that kind of blending between the real and the virtual, or atoms as we know them, as bits of real matter, and then pixels as a sort of atom in its own way of the digital world. And so I have a lot of enthusiasm for that. It's also a very challenging place to think about user interactivity and user experience. And so it's really fun for me because selfishly, maybe because I don't ever feel like there's a wrong answer, so that feels good, but also there's no right answers, and so that kind of slipperiness of that field is really fun for me. So that's where I'm at right now with it, I think.
And thank you. And Shane, I mean, since you are one of our alumni, I feel I can ask you, can you tell us what University of Oregon is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am running a couple of studies right now, my own independent study, and I'm a part of a study that's, we just picked up an NSF grant, which is great. And we're doing some work on virtual reality, constructing in Horizon Worlds right now. We are creating a simulation for BIPOC, which is people of color, who are also indigenous, right, representations of marine biologists and studying what krill looks like and taking it from the perspective of a child. And so we have some funding from NSF, and we're going to be touring it as like a Southern California tour for low-income individuals to be able to experience virtual reality as if they were marine biologists, and to like get on like an actual boat in the Antarctic and like pick up krill. And it's really, really cool, really, really fun. There's a lot of customization factors into it. So I'm super excited to be on that project. And as a PhD student, I do get summer opportunities to teach virtual reality in the summer for like senior students who are super interested in it. So I teach large concepts like identification, embodiment, and how it like all kind of incorporates itself into like the world of media, and how it can like be translated from gaming also to virtual reality, but also to like the world outside of us, right? So I do that. And then I also do my own independent study, which is trying to identify the particular independent and latent variables that contribute to virtual reality effects is what I'm working on. So hopefully I can determine that, but big project, small amount of time.
Well, you know, my next question actually will pick up on a question from the audience. The question from the audience is, what would be the pros and cons of incorporating metaverse or the metaverse-like technologies in teaching at higher education? So this is a great question, because I think that as part of IT, we typically talk about the benefits of using leading edge technologies, but there are some clear downsides to these technologies. So I'm curious what your perspective is. And may I invite you, Sean, to pick up this question?
Yeah. So I think one thing, maybe I'll just say one and then let the next person go. One thing that I think falls into the challenges, but also opportunities area is accessibility. So obviously there's some accessibility challenges around sight, hearing, mobility, that kind of thing in participating in, let's say, Beat Saber, right? So I know Oculus Quest and Meta and et cetera, whatever they're called this week, they have accessibility protocol and tools built into the platform now. And yet it remains a challenge. And it's one of the first questions over the last 5 or 6 years since we've been doing this that we've gotten. What about accessibility? What about the accessibility technology initiative here on campus? And so that's obviously a challenge that we're working through, that we're acknowledging of. And every, just on the boring administrative side, every procurement that we go through here, and those of us that buy things within the state of California know how painful that can be. We have to, and rightfully so, we create an equally accessible technology plan, something to that effect, saying, okay, if a student has this challenge or this different ability, they will have a different course material that will get them to the same learning outcome. So that's on the con side, but it's also, the accessibility factor is also an opportunity for students, let's say, that wouldn't otherwise be able to go on a field trip. Penn State had a presentation at EDUCAUSE a couple of years ago in which they showed a geological rock wall that many students couldn't come to because of one student was in a wheelchair. It essentially involved hiking getting to there, or one student had severe allergies, that kind of thing. So they were able to have a close to realistic experience using a headset and experiencing that. So they built out a whole platform. They did some research around it, found it was equally effective, and in some cases more enjoyable because the students thought it was interesting. Turns out that rock wall was actually demolished for a shopping mall or something like that. So they had that kind of digital twin then preserved in perpetuity. So, and there's lots of other examples here at SDSU as well, including a group in botany that goes down to Baja California, across the border, about 20-minute drive from here. But many students are undocumented, and for other reasons, they can't cross the border. They also ride on horseback. Students in a wheelchair cannot ride on a horse per these constraints. So we're creating digital artifacts of the specimens they would see out there so they can interact with those. So accessibility, both a pro and a con, I would say.
Thank you. Would anybody want to add something to the answer? How about you, Kate?
Well, I think certainly another broad challenge similar to accessibility is sort of the affordability and how resource intensive it can be. And that's on the hardware side, but that's also on the production side to either purchase, design, build, custom applications that can be resource intensive. And I think perhaps like another way to answer that question is again, it's somewhat situational. So the affordance is, how well does it align to what your learning goals are? So, I think what the goals might be for distant learners who might feel a lack of community, that the affordances could be different than students that are in an in-person, residence, experience, but aren't able to go on the study abroad or the field trip or the archaeological dig or something like that. So I think it's somewhat relative, but there's definitely those kind of more persistent challenges that are across the board.
Are there any other pedagogical potentials that you see in these technologies? So we talked about, we emphasized, all right, there are opportunities here, but also a lot of challenges on how do we implement these technologies. But with those challenges in mind, why is it worth pursuing some, this direction? And I don't know, Rob, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Just a great hand icon, you predicted it. I think I often think self and some of my students are challenged in their learning because they kind of can't shake the framework they're already in, They can't kind of break loose of their own internal patterns and their own external patterns in their life and their family and stuff. And I think anytime you sort of bring something this immersive and exploratory to the equation of teaching and learning, it feels like a real opportunity to, if done, thoughtfully, to kind of unravel ways that we've done things before, or unravel mentalities or approaches, and that feels really powerful, especially for metaverse technologies, because they are so potent, and so that is really exciting to me. But I will say that that care requires thoughtfulness and time, and those are hard to come by sometimes for all of us. And so I think it is something we need to be quite cautious about, even though I think the upside is worth taking some of that risk.
Thank you. I said earlier that we, based on the answers, it seems that there are two directions we could explore. One is these technologies of the visual that have the eye, as the core organ that is being addressed by the technologies. But we also have technologies of power, either in the form of cryptocurrency that we find talked about in connection with the metaverse, or I don't know, blockchain, for example, yet another technology that is supposed to disturb power in its various forms. So I wonder, how do you see the role of those technologies in education? And perhaps this question I'm going to address to Kate and Shane. So Kate, what is blockchain for education? What does it mean, and how is it going to go?
So I don't know how it's going to go. I think there are the kind of most compelling direction that I've seen it discussed in is the idea of ownership and students having agency over their own data. So what does it look like when credentials are on the blockchain, and kind of decentralized ownership versus having to, go to the registrar and pay for your transcript. So I think that's sort of one of the more kind of compelling and also universal visions of an application in higher education. But I'll stop there. It looks like Rob has a comment as well. Oh, is that, that's your hand up from last time. Oh, sorry to call you out like that.
Shane, would you like to comment?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, right? And we kind of like already see these implementations of like blockchains, or what's more commonly known like with the younger generation is like NFTs, right? So we see like these NFTs being exchanged from person to person, and we also can recognize them as like original pieces of work, right? That create value over time as they're being modified as like a singularity within this one system that's really not a singularity within the system, but is really just playing a part of like the larger discourse at hand. And it kind of goes back into like my first description of like the metaverse, is that it's not necessarily something that is nuanced or totally different from like the actual system that we played into. It's just another version of it. And like these revisionings are just going to keep continuing and continuing as like blockchains and NFTs decide to like develop and go further, or Bitcoin, for example. As that changes with society, we are going to see it more implemented in younger generations. And so I think it kind of like adds to like the education portion. Instead of looking at like higher education, we should really be looking at like education at like the most basic level, and trying to give an understanding of what blockchains really are and how they make their way into our day-to-day lives.
Rob, please jump right in.
Sorry, I do have one thought. I will admit that the kind of idea of a non-fungible token has always been very off-putting to me, because it feels like a gesture of exclusivity, and I don't care for that personally. But I have been thinking, I don't know if other people may have thoughts about this or done even more thinking or work on this than I have. But I've been researching this idea of time banking, which is a kind of idea that was developed in the 70s around you bank time that you've dedicated to a task for some on someone else's behalf, and then you can sort of carry around these tokens of effort that you've done, and you can trade, an hour for an hour with one person to someone else. And so, for example, like say I did some carpentry work for someone, for an hour, I could get that hour, and that hour goes into the time bank to credit for myself. But then I could go get my teeth cleaned by a dentist that participates in the time bank, and our hour is traded equally, even though our labor may be measured very differently in a capitalist system. And I've been sort of excited to bring that idea to students, because I think a lot of students are wrestling with how do they wield their knowledge in the world, and how do they kind of go forth and contribute back to the world, and also how do they feed themselves and their families. And I think perhaps something like a very fungible token or an infinitely fungible token of humanity could be a way to kind of wrestle back this kind of idea of a shared ledger and make it something different. And so it's just a curiosity I have that I've been thinking about. And to me, education seems like a really interesting place for that to grow. We'll see what happens.
Sean, oh my goodness. I mean, you are giving me ideas, Rob. I'm
Me too. Yeah, just
so go
quick
ahead,
comment,
Sean.
Rob. As you were describing that, I was thinking, well, in some ways, that is what a dollar bill or any other kind of token that we use does. It enables us to buy something later with the time that we committed to that. And I think it points out that time is the ultimate luxury now, including now that Netflix is launching a less expensive version that you have to spend some of your time watching advertisements. I think it's a pretty clear one-to-one ratio there. But and what I was thinking actually in terms of to your initial question, Mihaela, one of the challenges that we have is content, right? So obviously Facebook, Meta, et cetera, they're laying their stakes here, saying this is our metaverse. We're going to sell this to you, whether it's the time that you're spending watching our advertisements or the actual money you're paying us. And I think NFTs, blockchain, et cetera, could be a way that similar to how in academia, we dedicate our time to publishing, and then we get to say, we get to put our name on there, and we get to measure the efficacy of that based on the number of people that cite us, that kind of thing. With the blockchain and with NFTs, we could be contributing to a library or many libraries of content, and retain ownership of that, but in an open educational resource type of library, still be contributing to the greater good and not just selling our information or giving it away to the metas of the world.
I wanted to add too, just to kind of going back to the original question of like, what is the role of these technologies of power in higher education? You know, my initial answer is kind of what Shane hinted at, right? That we tend to think of things as like replacements. So like, is the metaverse the new LMS, or like, you know, is blockchain the new degree? And it's a tendency to kind of go to that like replacement model. But then another answer is that new technologies are what higher ed is all about. If you think of it as a space of knowledge production, you know, so you know, we've supported an interesting project on the use of blockchain for supply chain management in a business course, you know, and I think Rob's example like illustrates like you could do really creative, exploratory, that's what we should be doing, is exploring these things in kind of uncertain ways to find out what they are. But you know, my mind kind of goes towards the like higher ed, almost like administration part, like, well, what is this equal and what our current form is? So it's just a different kind of answer to the original question.
I love the answer because it reminds us that things that we take for granted today, like writing, used to be they are technologies, right? So we never know what is going to be used for meaning making. And I think that you are absolutely right, Kate, that higher education is about new technologies in that sense. Let me move on to slightly different term that has been making some waves in magazines such as the EDUCAUSE Review, namely this idea of a digital twin campus. Again, you know, this whole day today is about the ITS strategic plan and one of its goals, which is to create a virtual connection hub. And sometimes by that people hear digital twin campus. So I'm curious, what does it mean and how can campuses get there, or should they get there? So I guess I'm going to go back to Sean, because I'm sure San Diego State is way ahead of everybody with that.
Well, you know, we have small elements that we're working on right now that could be considered digital twin. I'll say that the term hasn't really made it into the conversation a whole lot. I've heard it more I was actually just here in San Diego at the Augmented Enterprise Summit, which had speakers from Boeing and Magic Leap and companies like that, talking a lot about digital twins. But we are doing some more in the area of augmented reality. For example, we're on Kumeyaay land here, indigenous land, and we acknowledge that every time we have a public meeting or event or town hall, that kind of thing. And we've actually invited elders of the Kumeyaay to work with us to create a land acknowledgement that you can see overlaid on top of our campus in augmented reality. So that's about as close as we've gotten, aside from virtual tours, which became much more relevant during the pandemic, where people were applying to school without being able to come here and take a tour. I will say I have been initially reluctant on a digital twin campus model, in that, for example, if we were to redesign, if we were to create a virtual cadaver lab, I would not, you know, limit ourselves to the four walls that exist in a small, you know, basement cadaver lab. Currently, I would say it should be on a, you know, a battlefield or in a operating room, or, you know, in environments that, again, are low frequency, high risk, or just impossible, right? Inside of the veins, that kind of thing. So I think there's a time and a place for digital twins when it is place-based, and there's a time to reject that and say, we're going to think outside the box, literally, in the case of a cadaver lab.
Thank you. Shane, go for it.
Yeah, so this is kind of like a new phenomenon that has like recently just like smacked me in the face. I do some research in my lab with this like esports and gaming lab. And what we've noticed is that a lot of our esports gamers have like actually been shifting from like our 2D screens, but shifting into the world of virtual reality to actually do their gaming. But what we also noticed too is that a lot of the participation, or a lot of the viewing or spectatorship, is not happening in virtual reality. It's actually too much of a taxing thing for participants to actually go into virtual reality to participate in the spectatorship, but they rather do it on like TikTok or Instagram or on Twitch, right? Using their phones specifically. So having a twin campus in virtual reality, I think would be really, really awesome, right? For instructors to go in there and actually be able to explore and grab things like in the virtual space to show students, but the willingness of students to reach into the virtual world and actually be present in virtual reality, I find that there might be some type of like cognitive dissonance in this relationship rather than just using like our cell phones, right? As we walk around with them every day. I think that the idea of replicating a university to be completely in virtual reality is great, but the modality and like the transfer of that particular media needs to be renegotiated for the accessibility purposes, of course, but also for like practicality, right? If we have students who are going to be attending in a virtual reality university, it needs to be able to be attended at any place in the world, right? Any spatial, I guess spatiality is also a large concept into this as well. But again, the idea of like having a duplicate campus where students attend in virtual reality, I think it might be a little too far to stretch at this point.
You reminded me, Shane, that according to our research, San Bernardino has the lowest rate of access to broadband in California. So the California rate is very close to 90%. San Bernardino is about 75%, right? So one has to wonder before we build the next Metaversity, whether people would actually be able to access it, not only if they want to access it. And, you know, case in point, the latest Oculus is $1,500. So again, you have to wonder to what extent would our students be able to attend a university in the metaverse if the key to accessing the metaverse is such an expensive device. So I guess what you are saying is before we have mass devices that can let us there, just like mobile phones do, perhaps it's a little bit premature to tout the metaversity.
It's always good to shoot high. So.
I think it will be interesting. So I tend towards kind of the Sean's orientation, right? Where you kind of want more, like when you have this blank canvas, kind of do the thing that's impossible or like kind of on the edges rather than kind of duplicate a thing that exists. But I wonder if, as we're kind of moving towards a future where things are hybrid more often and there's kind of higher demand for online, are we going to be nostalgic for place? And are there certain, landmarks and things about the physical campus that might actually help foster that campus identity and community in a virtual space? So I'm kind of of two minds. My initial thought was like, I'm not sure about the digital twin campus as a one-to-one unless you worked in admissions, but from a teaching and learning perspective, I think kind of more that unique situational design is preferable. But it could be that, I don't know, in 5-10 years there's a craving for place-based objects in virtual spaces.
Rob, I was just about to redirect that to you, so please go
cool.
ahead.
Yeah, I just have my own curiosity about, so digital twinning. I think of the kind of histories of digital twinning coming from this kind of engineering, simulation, and prototyping, and like trying to develop really a clear set of possible outcomes, and that feels pretty exciting when you think about many of us have served on committees before, and there's a kind of freezing that happens when people aren't sure of what possible outcomes are or what the ramifications of the outcomes are. And I do feel excited by this idea of a way to simulate possible outcomes, or at least have more information to kind of understand what could happen and kind of what the outcomes could be. And so you could, in a way, opens the door for more kind of possibly outrageous thinking or interesting thinking that could happen. You know, like you could do something like this is just a totally random one, but like, what if you had a perfect digital twin of a library, right? You could say like, well, what happens if we don't check out books anymore? People just take them off the shelves, right? And then they put them back in a pile in the front door or something, right? Like you could come up with these kind of outrageous scenarios in the digital twin, sort of like The Sims or something, you know, like gone haywire, and just see what happens. You know, would there be more students? Would an outcome be more reading, or would the outcome just be like all the books disappeared? You know, whatever. Like I don't know. And to me, like a digital twin seems like a really interesting place to be exploratory and maybe open the doors for more. I don't know about risk taking, but just more. More movement or more kind of sense of opportunity in the face of just being like, well, we don't know, so we didn't do anything. But
Rob, as you're describing that, I'm thinking about Google Earth, which is pretty much the ultimate digital twin of our planet, right? If, you know, how much money and effort and time Google and others have put into not only the surface and the topography of the Earth, but the individual buildings and the 3D buildings layer. And you mentioned kind of a sandbox where you could say, what if everyone just threw the books on the floor? What would that look like? How would we work within that? I think in terms of like GIS and other areas, looking at natural disasters and terrorist attacks and things, and how, you know, certain toxic fumes would travel through like the valley here in San Diego near our campus, and what the evacuation would look like. So I do think there's some merit to that now that you frame it that way.
There is also merit in the idea that Kate mentioned, that of community. I think what we found during the pandemic is that no matter how much we try to create communities online for our students, there was an element of embodiment that was missing. You know, being in the presence of others in a way that is not just, you know, intellectual and disembodied, but very material, that somehow this space is created. So Rob, I was wondering whether you've considered, you know, this intersection between space and body and community in some way, or Shane, because I know you are doing your research on that.
Rock, paper, scissors? No? Okay.
feel free to jump in. Yeah, excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So Rob, you actually kind of reminded me of this this project, and this is a little off course, but this project called Uncensored Library, that might be something for you to check out. It was one of the projects that were sent to the Peabody Awards committee that I was on, as far as like this digital library, right? But I don't, like, to your point, Mahela, I think like interpersonal interactions and interpersonal communication is like just so vital to the human existence, right? Just to us being. And I think that like is even presented in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We long for belonging, right? We long for relationship. However, I think of having the intersection between like embodiment, right, in a digital space versus embodiment in a physical space doesn't necessarily have to be so binary, right? It can be very much intertwined together, right? We can have a virtual university where we can also have a physical university where students are like taking place and learning in a digital environment and learning how the digital environment is constructed and how to navigate through a digital environment, but also being in the actual place in itself at the same time. Or vice versa, or one without the other, right? It's not necessarily such this like black or white decision. But again, I think this kind of goes back into the point of like integrating these types of practices and these types of technologies earlier than higher education. I'm always going to be a proponent for media literacy in elementary school, just because the way that technology has advanced, like we just really need to learn how it's being incorporated in our daily lives and in our daily societies, right? As like our wallets go on our phones now with Apple Pay, and we can like double click on our iPhone to pay with our phone, or even our watches. These are necessary things to understand, and having information abundance doesn't necessarily mean that you have a knowledge of everything. It might actually mean that you are so intimidated by all the information that is accessible to you that you really know nothing, and you feel like you know it all.
Yeah, I'm enjoying that. I had an interesting moment in my classroom the other day. A student is kind of concepting a virtual mall, and it created a really interesting conversation around what is a mall? You know, like what makes it a place that is interesting to some, repulsive to others. I don't know, whatever. All the things that a mall can be, a place where people hang out, or place, I don't know, where lots of different types of things happen. But it also kind of bubbled up some questions around uh, maybe the mall as like a site of creativity, or a site of like, um, it's a place where people kind of go to like peacock a little bit, you know, like they go and they like dress up and like do their thing. And like, maybe that sort of experience could be a part of the digital mall as well, and that like maybe you could develop your own sense of fashion or self-expression within the virtual mall, but then like maybe the clothes you buy or something in digital space could have an analog is a, my metaphor there, an analog in the real world that like that alters your sense of fashion for you, in real clothes. And I just thought that was a really fun conversation, and just an interesting kind of overlapping of like how might digital culture or the metaverse inspire us to behave differently and than in our physical selves. And that, I don't know, it felt like a fun, I don't know, place to think of that kind of overlapping between the two.
I think you're absolutely right, because as you were talking about what is a mall, I was thinking of a more basic question for us instructors: what is a classroom, and where does learning take place, and how, if we were to disentangle the classroom for the actual physical space where learning happens, and which we all imagine in a particular way given by our university, then how can we make learning happen very differently? So that's a really interesting point of view. I would also add to that again, you are absolutely right that these new technologies are forcing us to reconsider the meaning of various things and categories. I mean, I have in mind, for example, how algorithmic classifications are forcing us to reconsider what does it mean to be a woman and what does it mean to be a man. And maybe you are only 75% woman and 25% man, according to Google. So what does that mean? And what does that do for our conversations? So it's really interesting to reflect on what does it mean to learn in a very different way in these spaces that are forcing us to reconsider how space should even be thought about. I think we are coming up on the end of this panel, which is a real pity, because I think that we are starting to have a lot of fun here. And I think that the audience also agrees based on the comments in the chat. So I'm going to wrap it up by asking a question that I think everybody is wondering. So how can campuses help instructors, and how they can help students with this new brave world that's coming up? And I will direct that question first to Sean, because you are the Director of Instructional Technologies at San Diego, and of course to Kate, wondering how can the system can help the campuses go there.
Yeah, and I was just putting in the chat, if anyone hasn't seen We Met in Virtual Reality on Netflix, I definitely recommend it. Rob, your mention of peacocking reminded me of that. Just people get to wear kind of outlandish things in virtual worlds, like are documented there. And Mihaela, your mention of kind of gender exploration, and maybe I'm a woman in VR on the weekends, and that's okay because I can come back to work and live in my physical body in a different way. So the question, can you rephrase it just one more time? Because I was distracted because I was putting that comment in there. Thank you.
So the question now is, how can IT services help instructors and students get there? So I'm asking you first, because you are doing so much work in this area.
Thank you. So our approach since about 2016, 2017 has been kind of a provide the gear and they will come, right? So we have not standardized on any one particular technology or one piece of hardware, company, et cetera. We have intentionally purchased one or more devices and pieces of software of all the different flavors across the spectrum. And starting with just a couple faculty, we have built about 75 faculty across dozens of types of courses and thousands of students at this point. And I think the majority of the success that we've had over the last few years and our approach going forward is to enable the full spectrum of both content creation, but not expect everyone to be an expert in C# and Unity and that kind of thing, as well as content consumption, and really marrying the two with student organizations. We have about 3 student orgs that we work with who are hungry for real world projects, that we partner them with faculty, with campus partners, with industry partners, et cetera. And it really has created an ecosystem in itself. We just launched a research center around this ecosystem that I'll post into the chat. But it is a kind of mutually beneficial interdisciplinary ecosystem. So my advice is kind of provide the gear, provide the resources, the faculty, the students will come, and you'll be surprised at what they're able to do. It's really impressive.
Thank you. And Kate, how can the system help campuses get there?
Yeah, so I have kind of 2 answers to that. I think with from one lens from IT, I think there's a lot of enabling infrastructure that this kind of technology sits on top of, right? So just making sure we have the network power. I think having some kind of repository where we can share across the system, objects and artifacts, and that can be remixed and reused in other contexts. I think kind of establishing and advocating for accessibility, privacy, data protection, and so on is kind of something that we could do both, on behalf of the campuses, but like to vendor partners. And kind of the CSU is such a powerhouse in terms of its size that, we can really exert some pressure in making sure those things are prioritized. And then, kind of from my other instructional design hat, I would say with faculty and students, it's really like it's treating it like any other digital tool. So, there's this kind of, very simple, like, having clear learning goals and thinking about how to scaffold the experience for students. So whatever new technology they're trying out, like having something kind of defined with some support in place, and then having some kind of measurable outcome that you'd like to work towards that then you can iterate from and get feedback on, is really kind of the foundational part with whatever tool you're using.
Thank you so much. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and give the audience a chance to ask questions directly if they so wish. If not, don't worry, I have one more curiosity that I'm going to articulate. So is anybody in the audience curious to ask a question live? If not, go ahead and put it in the chat. Okay, well, in that case, here's my curiosity. So we talked about what's coming, and each of us has a dream, what we would like to see in the classroom, what we would like to see in terms of research in the metaverse. So I'm really curious about yours. What excites you about the metaverse? What is the pie in the sky for you? So may I ask you, Rob, and then Shane, and we'll end with Sean and Kate.
This is such a hard question. I think the thing that excites me the most is we don't know what's going to happen. Like we don't know what will happen to music, into art, into culture, into finance, and I realize that's a very easy thing to be excited about if you feel comfortable, and it's a very thing to feel very unexcited about if you aren't feeling so comfortable in your life. So I'll definitely acknowledge that. But I just think anytime we have an opportunity to kind of maybe be more attentive to our culture and also more attentive to undoing certain cultural norms, those are rich moments in my life, or might be. And so that to me feels the most potent and exciting.
Thank you. And for you, Shane?
Yeah, it's the research for me. I am just so excited to see all of these new articles coming out about virtual reality and education and how it's showing that there's higher rates of retention being with like lessons and outcomes that are being taught in virtual reality because students have the time to really sit with the issues and move it around to their own personal learning perspective. So that's really cool. A big thing that I have really just like been diving into is like understanding the difference of like identity roles and customization, and looking at how these customized avatars in virtual reality and in like these spaces like Second Life, and how the person is actually in like reality, and looking at like that relationship and where like the ties connect and where they disconnect, and showing that really dynamic sort of thing. And so I think the metaverse is really bringing that into a very observable reality where we can actually like sit down and watch people interact within horizons or within the metaverse. And so I really, really, really excited about research. So
And Sean, what excites you?
So I'm finding myself drawn to a kind of boring, pragmatic reason, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I think there's a lot of dystopian ways that I could take this question in terms of human connection and lots of other things. But the thing that excites me the most, to be honest, is not having to look down, having to use my carpals, in ways that are damaging, things like that. We designed, again, I go back to the rectangle. We designed this because it can fit in my pocket. I believe it's approximately that size because of that reason. We've kind of miniaturized things for that reason. I think if we can get back to true ergonomics where things are really just human scale, human shape, that kind of thing, so that we're not looking down all the time, we're not glued to our computers, and hopefully back on the dystopian or utopian side, hopefully that will result in more human connection because we're actually looking at one another while pulling up that email that we needed to reference in the conversation rather than looking down. I realize there's a shadow side to that where you're having a conversation and you're watching Netflix at the same time or whatever, but that's my dream. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kate, last words, what excites you?
So I think what I'm most hopeful for, and this is just higher ed broadly speaking, moving forward, is higher degrees of flexibility and agency for learners. And so to the extent that virtual reality is a prong to help achieve that, or it's one of the ways that we get there, I think that's, to me, is the most exciting part about it.
Thank you. With that, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists today. This was a really fun conversation. We learned a lot, and it also gave us, I hope, like it gave me, a ton of ideas to pursue. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom. And now I would like to give it back to James Trotter to introduce our next panel. Thank you so much.
Before this panel leaves, I do want to add one thing. The one thing that I find most exciting is I get the opportunity to collaborate and work with all of you. That is probably the one thing I find the most fun about the future is it's this group here together and the collaborations and the teamwork that we have to see where the future is in that collaboration. So I am probably one of the most luckiest people that I can say in the CSU because I get to work with all of you, and I'll see some of you very shortly. So